I have all this tech assistance. Okay, perfect. Again, ladies, thank you so much for joining me on this last day of Women's History Month. Thank you for helping in so many ways by the work that you do for this concept, Voices Behind the Vote, Women of Color Changing the Political Landscape for 2016 and beyond. And so I can't thank you enough. I thank you for your expertise and, more importantly, your commitment to make sure that we are in the game, that we change the game, and that we stay in the game. And so I know that I want to be mindful of everybody's time. We've had some technical difficulties, but I just want to, I'm going to do a quick overview and then we're going to get into the questions. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me and see me.
Yes.
Okay, great. I think we lost Jessica again. Hopefully she'll be back shortly. But just want to set the stage, and just so we know, for women and people of color, the power of the vote has been instrumental in helping to expand opportunities in employment, education, and beyond. And so we know that. And for so many, on so many levels, to level the playing field so that everyone has a chance to succeed. And we, women of color, have really been at the forefront of that effort. And you know that in 2012, African American women exercised their right to vote at a higher rate than any other group, particularly African American women of color. And so we could go on and on about the whys and whatever, but what we do know for sure is that we have made tremendous strides. But we're all clear that it's certainly not enough. And now that we have your attention, what should we be doing? And so I'm going to go right into the questions. Jessica, good to see you back, and thank you again for joining. I know you're at the airport. So if we could talk a little bit, the first question I want to pose to you is the power of women of color, specifically African American women, will continue to grow. And elected officials must respond to the growing needs of this increasingly and highly influential political voting bloc. Given this information, how can women of color ensure their voices are heard and that their demands are met? And just a quick sidebar, you know, we know that we're voting, we know how to get out the vote, but I'm convinced that that's not enough. And so, given that information, how do we ensure that women of color, that their voices are heard and that their demands are met? And if I could go to Jessica.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I think in terms of how we make sure that our voices are heard, given the critical context that we exist in right now, for us organizationally at Black Youth Project 100, the first thing that we do is that we make sure that we're actually controlling the programs that are going into.
Jessica, I lost you.
What the messages are behind the programs, but we don't actually talk about who are the people that are delivering those messages, who are the people making those decisions around these programs, who are the people leading those programs. So for us, that's where we start very clearly, is by making sure that the people we're trying to get to are the people who are making the decisions, leading the programs, managing the programs. And so we have young Black women, young queer folks that are at the front face decision-making body at every level of our work. And I think then beyond that, we also make sure that we have a presence around this election, but also before this election, talking about policy that impacts.
I think we
lost her.
I think we lost her as well. So we'll come back to Jessica. Khyla, can I come to you with that question?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Well, and thank you again, Andrea, for what you all do for strategic partnerships here with us at the NAACP. I would co-sign with Jessica that it's important for us to stay engaged throughout the electoral process. It's not enough for us just to vote. Voting is extremely important, and we want to vote at the level or even higher than what we did in 2012. But it's also engaging our elected officials before and after the vote, really holding them accountable, participating as the NAACP does throughout the year with our action alerts. Our Washington Bureau frequently sends out action alerts. talking about our legislative agenda. And it's important for women of color, African American women, and all persons who are concerned about the civil rights agenda to call your elected officials, visit them when they're in your district, so you can really engage with them and speak to them about the issues that matter to you. Case in point, the members of Congress right now are wrapping up their Easter break, so they're at home in their districts. And there are many pieces of legislation on the federal level that we are very concerned about. This is an opportune time for you to go while you're at home and while your congressperson is also at home to really engage them, let them know. You can take the talking points that we give out on our website at naacp.org and speak to them about what we are concerned about, or just speak to them about what you are concerned about that may be outside of our legislative agenda, so that they can understand how powerful your voice is, and to let them know that should they not vote in a way that you deem acceptable, then you will use your power at the ballot box in November. And also educating folks in your community about why it's so important to vote, why it's so important to hold our elected officials accountable on every level, not just the federal level, and put forth and work with your community members to even put forth pieces of legislation and lobby that to your member of Congress or your local elected official that you feel would address the concerns in your community.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Erin, we're going to get to you. If I could...
I think...
Oh, Faith, go ahead.
Okay. I'm just going to jump in there. I agree, as the National Action Network and the NAACP are advocate organizations, and I work with Hillary up here on the Hill, and it's very important that women, and particularly African American women, take their issues to the members of Congress. And I mean, we have to make sure that issues such as health care is a primary issue for women. Just look at the presidential candidates who have talked about recently about abortion rights. That's a key issue for our folks across the country, and we have to let them know that this is the issue that is important to us, and how we feel, and what we want our leaders to do. In terms of voting rights, we really have to hold the fire to our elected officials. It's been almost 1,000 days since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1964, particularly the Section 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act. We have to go, and the Supreme Court basically kicked it back to Congress. So we have to talk to all of our elected officials and say our right to vote is a right. We fought for it, we've died for it, and we have to protect it. It's on us to protect it. And they're not going to act until we act. So that means mobilizing everyone, from our aunts, nieces, even our brothers and sisters need to get into the fight and tell them that this is very important to us. And yes, while they're still on Easter break in their community, it's a prime opportunity to go by their office and say, hey, Congressman, we want you to do this for the Voting Rights Act. We want you to do this for the Affordable Care Act. We want you to do this for education. These are issues that are our bread and butter staples for both the NAACP and for National Action Network. And for order for our elected officials to take us seriously, we have to take ourselves seriously and knock on their door, bang on their doors, and say, this is what we want you to do.
Faith, thank you so much. I'm going to let Erin answer that question, but I'd like to come back to something both you and actually the three of you have talked about, and that is Section 4 and 5. And my concern is that people don't really understand the urgency of what that means. And so, but again, I'll come back to that, but I just want to throw that out there. Erin, thank you so much for joining us, and I'd like to get you to weigh in on, again, given the information that we shared, how can women of color ensure their voices heard and that their demands are met?
Right. Yeah. So, like we've been saying, a lot of women, Black women, are in the forefront of this movement, and I think one thing that we are concerned with, I know specifically in Texas in the Youth and College Division, but Region 6 that I now represent on the national board, is being sure that we're incorporating that electoral piece when we're talking about strategy for direct action. And so I know with youth and college chapters, a lot of times we get on the, we hop, out there on the ground. We want to protest. We want to be proactive. We want to engage at the grassroots level. But things that we really that we really try to reinforce with our youth and college chapters is that need for the Wellstone Triangle and trying to engage on all aspects of direct action. And so while we encourage, kids, youth and college students who want to get on the ground, we really like to enforce the importance of the electoral vote and organizing for the electoral process, and in an effort to move toward the direction that we want to go, so that we can actually make political changes on the policy level. So that's one thing that I know that I'm constantly reinforcing with youth and college chapters across Region 6 in the state of Texas, is to be sure that we are being strategic in the way that we are organizing on these issues around in the grassroots arena. So for those individuals, just understanding that there's importance of using your vote, that understanding that the right to protest is in fact a right that is given to us by the Constitution, and exercising that right within the proper protocol, in addition to strategy moving toward mobilizing people to get out the vote, to actually make those policy and legislative changes that are actually necessary. So that's one thing that I know we speak about, because a lot of Black women are, in the front of the movement, and so we're encouraging other Black women who have leadership positions across the state of Texas and in the region to be sure that they're mobilizing people to utilize their capacity to vote, as well as their ability to organize and bring people together on whatever issues that they see necessary for whatever communities that they're representing within the NAACP and otherwise.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. One of the things, because we had some technical difficulty, I did not introduce these amazing women to you, and I want to do that very, very quickly. We have Faith Blackburne, who is the Associate Bureau Chief for the National Action Network in D.C. We have Craine, who is, we boast as our own, and she is, Assistant General Counsel for the NAACP. Erin Gaddis, who is a National Board Member for the NAACP and hails out of Region 6. And Jessica Pierce, who we claim, I know I do, who is the National Chair for the Black Youth Project, BYP 100. And so my apologies for not doing that initially, but I wanted to make sure that that everybody knew that. And so, Faith, I'm sorry, it sounded like you were asking me a question.
Now, I just wanted to also add in, I think recently within the last month here in Maryland, the General Assembly pushed the re-entry vote. They actually overrode the veto from Governor Hogan, and now you have a lot of formerly incarcerated folks who will be released the right to vote, and that's direct action of us holding our elected officials accountable and what the power of our voice is. And once we do that, we see that in Maryland and a few other states. And I think Virginia had it on their ballot or discussed it, and I think they're now looking at the same action to allow folks who are re-entering the community the right to vote. So again, this is direct action from us to our legislators, and it shows how important that is, because almost 40,000 people in Maryland will now be exercising their rights to vote. So if you can imagine, if you could just say, and I'm just throwing out hypothetical numbers, if you have 40,000 people who are now coming back into our communities, and you times that across the country in the 50 states or the 40 other states that do not have or will have voting folks coming out. You can imagine how that will impact the electoral process.
Great.
So that's very key point there. We are making our voices heard through our legislative folks as well.
Let's talk. I want to get Jessica, because I know that you're at the airport, but if we could talk a little bit about, one of the things that we understand is that we don't always maximize our voting strength. And if we look at nearly 88% of children in Ferguson's public school, and we'll just use Ferguson as an example, are black, and only 1 in 7 of Ferguson's school board is black. With this type of political capital, how can women of color, specifically women of color, influence local politics, ensure they have majority representation in their communities, and educate their communities on how to maximize their voting strength? Jessica, can I start with you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing for me is when I look at situations like that, I mean, that's the case in Ferguson, that's the case in so many cities across this country.
Absolutely.
And I think that we have to stop expecting that the systems that exist that guide our society are going to do right by us, because they were built to not do right by us. They were built to not represent us. And so I think when we start from that as a base in context, then we can have a real conversation about what it means to do 3 foundational things that I do in all of my work. I said the first thing that we're trying to do is we need to make sure that people are aware of their own power that they inherently have. And I think that power is about exercising that power through this election, but it's also about building that political independent power within and outside of these elections. It's having a conversation about how are we training people, how are we building them to understand what power even is, and have a conversation about it on an ongoing basis. And then once we, are making sure people are aware of their own power, how are we actually altering the relations of power? We have to have a conversation, and not just about representation. We have to shift the conversation and start talking about what is the difference between representation, equality, and equity. And the only one of those I'm really focused on is equity, which is not equality and is not representation, and really talks about really shifting that power dynamic. And then I think the third thing is really about winning concrete change that actually improves people's lives, and making sure that change is actually sustainable. And that change comes through representation, through using our individual vote and making sure that we're actually increasing that vote through these election cycles. And that also means making sure that we are occupying those other spaces that Erin talked about within the Wellstone Triangle. It's making sure that we're building public policy that represents our issues in our communities. It means making sure that we have more people that are running that look like us and also have the same shared values that we have. It also means building those campaigns outside of those systems and building our own political power outside of those systems that can withstand and overtake those systems.
Do you think we know how to do that? I love your analysis, and I think it's critical. But do you think we know how to do that?
I think we do. I think the problem sometimes is I think that we get caught up in not having the right language or having to present in a particular politics and a particular disposition. And I think the thing that we tell our young people every day is whether you're on the streets or you're in institutions of higher education, whether you're in the courtroom or you're sitting in board meeting rooms, you are an expert of your own experience. And being an expert of your own experience gives you enough to be able to realize that you have power to do what you need to do to really make change for your community.
Okay, thank you so much. Khyla, you want to comment on the question I asked?
Yeah, and I think that it helps to kind of back up and talk about your earlier question about the Voting Rights Act. And just kind of briefly, what Faith was alluding to is that in Shelby County versus Holder, the United States Supreme Court in 2013 stated that Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was unconstitutional, and kicked it back to the Congress for them to reauthorize it. And what Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act does is that it sets out a formula of what states, either in whole or in part, should be covered by Section 5, and Section 5 was a pre-clearance. So basically, these municipalities or some whole states had to get permission from either the Department of Justice, their voting section, or the U.S. District Court here in D.C. to make any changes in the time, place, and manner of voting. Because those municipalities and states had a historic record of discriminating against Black people and other people of color. And so that was a protection for people of color in those municipalities and states. That was gutted in 2013, and since day one, many of our organizations, the NAACP, National Action Network, and so many other civil rights organizations and other organizations that care about voting rights for all people have been fighting tirelessly for the Congress to reauthorize that provision and strengthen the entirety of the Voting Rights Act. There are other provisions, like Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that still allow for persons and entities to sue municipalities or states for discriminatory laws, and that gets us to the Ferguson conversation, where in Ferguson, the NAACP, the Missouri State Conference of the NAACP, and other individual plaintiffs actually sued the Ferguson Florissant School District because it was because how they drew their district lines was unconstitutional. And so that we really have to be focused about how the district lines are drawn when we speak about whether or not we have power. In this particular school district, everybody votes at large. And so instead of being able to say, I'm in District 1 and I can vote for somebody who represents me from District 1, all the votes come from the entire county, or excuse me, the entire Ferguson Florissant School District area, which we state dilutes people of color, Black people in particular, in our ability to vote. And Andrea, something very important that I want to highlight for this particular school district is that even though Black people are just south of 50%, it's pretty much even between whites and Blacks in this school district area. It's about 47% that live in this area, 46% or so for 44% for Black people that live in the Ferguson Florissant School District. However, over half of the students that are living or that go to the schools in that district are Black, and less than I believe it's 13% of white students actually attend those school districts. And so you're talking about the power that we have. We're suing that school district to make sure that they are single member districts so that Black people can actually utilize their voice and elect a candidate of their choice. That's what the Constitution allows. That's what Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act also allows. It's making sure that our vote is not diluted. And if I can just say quickly that redistricting is a very confusing sometimes issue for some of us if you're not really kind of deep into the issue, but it's so very important. How your district lines are drawn directly impacts your ability to select candidates of your choice. It also directly impacts the amount of money that is attached to your particular district. You might hear a lot in the conversations about election gerrymandering. Mm-hmm. We have another case out of the Commonwealth of Virginia talking about that same issue, about how lines are drawn. So if you guys hear about this in your news, definitely pay close attention, because how your lines are drawn directly impacts about how competitive your districts are, if you actually have a single member district, and if you have an at-large district like you do in Ferguson, it impacts how you're actually able to select persons of your choice. Lastly, like you said, only one person is African American in the school district. However, less than just a little over 10% of white children actually attend this school district. So we really need to be mindful about those things so that we can make our voices heard when they're trying to draw the lines for election districts.
Let me jump in there. When we talk about Ferguson, it is unfortunate that the catalyst that sparked the movement that we now know as Black Matter and All Lives Matter, which unfortunately was the death of Mike Brown in Ferguson. But I think because of that incident, you have you've seen an increase in the number of black elected officials that are now serving in Ferguson on the city council. I believe they have a new sheriff or deputy that are now in there serving the community. And when you start to talk about representation and movement, National Action Network, as well as NAACP and other groups, were on the ground working with the community to make sure that our elected officials and the governor, and I can't call his name at the moment, moved to secure a special prosecutor to see that even though it did not pan out the way we thought it should have, but I believe that when you have events like this, while they may seem singular in area, but it is a pandemic around the country and even around the world. These incidents spark our activity, our activism. People who got out there and said, no more, we're going to have this happen in our communities. And it's because of that we see the young lady who took down the Confederate flag in South Carolina. We see the birth of Black Lives Matter Nation, how it's impacted the presidential campaigns at Bernie Sanders rallies, at Hillary Clinton, and hoping we could get them in at the Trump rallies. But we see that kind of activism, and when we start talking about women of color, these young ladies have taken it upon themselves to do those things. So we do see activism happening around the country, and again, I say sorry that it sparked around the Mike Brown instances, but I know National Action Network has been on the ground in the trenches alongside our NAACP folks and ACLU folks, making sure that our voices are heard and that the change of how things are done are happening. And we see that, I think Ferguson elected 2 new city council people, who one is a young lady, and I think 2 young ladies since that has happened. And so that, I think, is sparking.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead,
that is sparking the activism of women of color in the voting ranks.
Okay, thank you. Good, Khyla. Go ahead before I go to Erin. Go ahead.
I kind of wanted to uplift and piggyback off what Faith is saying, is that, but we want to be really clear that the Black Lives Matter hashtag was founded by 3 Black women. Bree Newsom is a black woman, as a young Black woman. Jessica and Charlene Carruthers, who's I think her co-national director at BYP 100,
Absolutely.
is a Black woman. So young Black women are at the very forefront of this movement, and you also have Janetta out of St. Louis, who was on the ground along with DeRay McKesson in advocating for Mike Brown throughout the beginning stages. And you saw young people that were there on the ground. So there are a lot of young Jews that have taken up this banter that maybe started in Ferguson but has spread like wildfire across the country and around the world, that I really want to make sure that we are intentional about uplifting as we're talking about the impact of Black women in our political spaces, but also just in activism in general.
Absolutely. No, thank you for doing that. Erin, can I get you to comment on that question?
Yes. I think, again, it goes back to making people aware of the necessity to pay attention to local politics. That is one of the things that, again, I represent the Youth and College Division. We don't necessarily know how to turn out the vote when it comes to local elections. A lot of times we bring a lot of attention to the presidential election, and I know this last year, Texas NAACP had a specific Youth and College Division had a specific campaign called Midterm Matters to just address that issue of local politics in general across the board for youth and college chapters. And so that's something, again, that we have to put on the forefront and help people to understand their power in the realm of local politics. And that plays a role all the way down to the people you interact with or the people who are leading the schools that you are educated in as a youth council member. Also, this is also the parents' responsibility, again, to be engaged in local politics so that their students have the best public education, or education is looked at as a priority for people of color, because we're taking it upon ourselves to be engaged in local politics. And so not to say that, again, just getting representation there is going to be a end all be all, but at least just mobilizing people to acknowledge that there is power in those smaller local elections, I think is really the first step, because a lot of people don't even understand what the benefit of that is, because there's not as much hype around, electing a city councilman or somebody to the school board. And so that's something, again, that we're trying to help students to understand the benefit and getting involved on that level. So then we can start having those conversations about redistricting and gerrymandering and why that's important and how that actually affects how we're represented in Congress, and in turn, policy and all those things play a role in that, but you got to get people to understand the power that we have right here in our own communities. And so, again, with youth on social media and in the media in general, obviously you're not going to see, your small town represented in these larger conversations. And so that's why it's up to, community organizers like NAACP and all those other individuals who are on the ground representing those within their own communities to mobilize those individuals to get out the vote on the local level.
Thank you so much, Erin. So there are a couple of things before I get to this last question. I'm going to call Jessica first, but Khyla, thank you for pointing out the power of women of color and citing examples so that we are always clear of our power and our voice. And Erin, you bring up an interesting point about the midterm matters, because what we see is, we always think the exhibition of political strength is reserved for the presidential election. And the truth is, it's not. Midterms are important. And so I think we've got to figure out a strategy to make sure that people are engaged during that time and that they see that as equally as important. But Jessica, before I get to this last, I love the last question that I'm going to ask the panel is, you said, you got to be an expert of your own experiences. And I love the thought of that, because number one, it reminds us that we have power, but it influences some of the decisions that we make and that other people make around us. And so just so you know, I'm going to be using that more often. So, but if we could get to the final question is, almost 50 years ago in May of 1969, during the congressional remarks about equal rights for women, one of the things that Shirley Chisholm referenced, she referenced the disparity of women, and specifically women of color in Congress. And, one of the things that she says, and she cites a number of factors for that. But one I think that is disturbing is that she states that blacks and women submitted to the oppression and even at times cooperated with it. Now, whether we agree or disagree, I guess my question to you is, do you believe that that is the case today? And if it's not, what do you believe is the deterrent keeping women of color, specifically women of color, from seeking political office locally and nationally at a higher rate than what we currently see? And I know that, the landscape is changing, but I don't believe in 2016 it's changing enough. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the first thing is that, yeah, I mean, I think it does still happen in a lot of ways to this day, and I think the first piece that I hear when I hear that quote, and I think of the old readings and the videos that I used to watch of Shirley Chisholm, is that coming back to what I said about power, because for me, all of this is about power, is that nobody tries to take away anything that's not inherently powerful. And I think when we look at our community and the consistent attacks against our community, the consistent attacks to take away our voice and to take away our power, is because we are inherently powerful. That exists. System-wise within this country, and I think understanding that, I think there's constantly, people trying to take away that power, and I think unfortunately sometimes what we see is divisions within our community, and I even see it within my own work right now. A lot of the questions I get are, now young Black people are doing things that are completely different than what traditional civil rights organizations do, and I always start with a response of that's just completely false. I grew up in a lot of these organizations. I used to be, on the team at the NAACP. These are tried and true practices, and that's the case of a lot of the leaders within this new, Black organizing world. I think also is that, we don't see this as an oppositional thing between age or between institution and non-institution. For us, this is really about the folks that we disagree with. We disagree on values and issues, and that can happen, amongst any line. And I think, but a lot of times they try to play that division line. I think the other thing what happens is that we have to inherently understand that the systems we exist within are anti-Black, and that a lot of times they try to make Black people the face of anti-Blackness, and that we can't allow that to happen. And part of that means that we have to consistently, when we're on those panels and in these spaces, make sure that we're not allowing people to put us in a situation where we're in an adversarial dynamic. We are all together. We're all on the same boat as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
And if we're going to get to freedom, everybody has to play their role. So you need to play your role in your organization. You need to play your role in your community and know how we all are pieces of the equation to make this happen. And so I think that, consistently checking myself as an individual, checking my organization, and then hoping that other folks are doing that so that we can really, try to get to this place where we actually are winning and keeping those things.
Great, thank you so much. Khyla, can you weigh in?
Yeah, I think that, as usual, Jessica's absolutely right. I think also that though we may not be in the numbers in Congress or in elected official spaces, that doesn't mean that we're not having our influence in other matters. Faith in her role at the Washington office of NAN. As a Black woman, she's able to look at the policies that NAN is pushing from a organizational context, but also how would it affect women and girls that are Black. The former head of the Washington office of the ACLU is a Black woman. You also have many Black women that are legislative aides on Congress and in elected official spaces. You also have yourself, who is our chief strategy officer, who is working with our different friends from across the civil rights community and religious community and sororities and fraternities, so that we are lending our voice in other ways. I think we do need to be more. There should be more Black women. There should be more women in general in Congress, but the Black women in particular, especially when we're talking about some of the health and educational and job issues that Faith was alluded to earlier, because women are hit and Black women are hit disproportionately worse than that when you're talking about all of these disparities. So we definitely need to be in a voice that we can vote, but a lot of these things happen from in the background. And so just because we're not up front, you can't see us, doesn't mean that we're not there. So I think it's a both and, not just in either or as far as our participation in the electoral process. That being said, Shirley Chisholm is an icon, right? And so she was looking at it from a different space than we're able to look at it almost 50 years later, I guess.
Absolutely.
Just shy of 50 years later. And so looking at it, I think from this vantage point allows us to say, how can we be more, how can we participate more? I have a friend of mine who is the president of her Young Democrats in South Carolina. So she is energizing young Black girls to see that they can be involved in the political spaces on the state level. She's energizing a friend of ours from college who is running for her school board. She also is who's a Black woman. She also is energizing someone who's running for the House of Representatives in South Carolina, who's a Black male. Her influence as in that position transcends her state, but she may not be lifted up yet. But just the influence that she is able to do on her local level speaks volumes. So I think that in order to kind of break down the barriers of how Black women are being represented in these electoral spaces, but I also think that just because you don't see us doesn't mean that we're not there.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Faith, you want to weigh in?
Absolutely. I have to think that when you look back traditionally and historically, when you think of Fannie Lou Hamer, when she gave her infamous "I am tired of being sick and tired" speech on the floor of the Democratic National Convention, you have to recognize that she was one of those grassroots women that came through the trenches and worked vigorously to make sure that Black African Americans were guaranteed the right to vote, one, and two, that their voices were heard in the political process. And you also have to look at when I think of some of the NAACP founders, Ida B. Wells, who, as an abolitionist, worked vigorously to get blacks freed at that point, and then also worked in the women's suffrage movement. As an African American woman, her voice was being heard, and she spoke for millions of women of color at that time. So I think African American women have always been on the scene, sometimes not as said before in the forefront, but certainly on the behind the scenes, making things happen. And we continue to. If we look at women today, a lot of women, our mothers and grandmothers, worked during the day to make sure that we were had a good education, upbringing, and all of that. But I look at my own mother and grandmother; they were very active in the political scene. And still are very active, and I think it's something that we have to continue to, as I guess you guys are millennials and Generation X. I guess I'm still in the baby boomer generation, but we have to make it generational and bring each other, our young ladies, along. And show them, because now we're faced with the issue of our young people not knowing what it means to vote, or not knowing what the right to vote is. So we have to make them recognize what the history behind the right to vote was, the importance of it, and also show them, okay, take them to the polls, take them to public hearings that are happening. And these are all part of the political process that help them recognize the importance of it. And I look at Shirley Chisholm. She was an inspiration. She was one of few women, African American women. You have Barbara Jordan, who was also in Congress as a strong voice in Congress. But I'm sure if you look at her both of their track records, they brought along a slew of younger people behind them and encouraged them to get involved in the political process. And I think it's important that we continue in their same vein and do that. It is vitally important, because it makes our everyday existence has to be, or is relegated by, the political process. From the time we are born, from the time till we die. Our birth certificates are political, our death certificates are political, our voting rights, school, everything we do has an implication in the political process, and that's part of the education that we have to go into the schools, start at the young age. Elementary school kids need to know what it's like to vote. bring it in. There's the League of Women Voters, who I'm sure would love to work with anyone that's interested to see what a ballot is, what initiatives are on your ballot. And when we went back, I believe we talked a little bit ago about the midterm election. Those midterm elections, are much more important than the presidential one, because we have our local elected officials from city council, from the mayor's office, governors, school boards, dog catcher, you name it. Those elections are happening on an off-year election, and those have a direct impact on our communities. And so we need to be the educators, the Fannie Lou Hamers, the Barbara Jordans, and Shirley Chisholm of our generation, to make sure that the generation that's behind us doesn't forget and are able to participate in the electoral process. So I think that when you talk about the quote that Shirley Chisholm was saying, I think she was coming from a position of, we can't allow our inactivity to continue on. We have of our fate. And I'm going to go with Jessica's quote early on. We are and I'm probably misquoting you, but we are the masters and the bestsellers of our own activism.
Good. Thank you so much, Faith. Erin, can I get you to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think I don't necessarily know if it's true that we have been deterred from the political process.
That's fair.
Only because I think, I don't know if we're necessarily deterred as Black women, but I know that societally we may not be supported in the event that we are moving toward the direction of being a part of the larger political movement. And then also, I know as the years have gone on, we've had not as much as we should, but we have gotten a little bit more representation within Congress. And then I know recently there was just the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls that was started by Bonnie Watson Coleman, Robin Kelly, and Yvette Clarke. And so those
Right.
women, I know definitely, if that's something that you're interested in, I always look to people like Robin Kelly when in the way that she runs her office and her district and different things that she's done. But again, I know the buck doesn't necessarily have to stop with those political offices. And so while we may not be moving as progressively as we can in these larger political spaces, I think our power is still on the ground within the community, and how we're able to impact and empower those that are directly around us is just as important. And as we see, historically, like I said earlier, Black women have been in the front, and again, with Black Lives Matter and all the different things that are going on, we're still in the front of it. I can see it on my campus at Baylor University. Most, if not all, of our executive committees for the majority of our student organization, Black, white, and otherwise, have representation from Black women. So I think we may be channeling our energy in a bunch of different directions, but I don't want to necessarily count us out of the political process just because we're not holding these offices, because we are mobilizing people to get out and use their vote, and there are individuals who are making an effort to become a part of the greater political system. And so I definitely agree that there are a ton of deterrents that are in fact out there that make it a little bit harder for us to become part of those spaces. But I do believe that our power on the ground and within ourselves is just as important, and I think we're seeing a lot of that come up with a lot of the movements that we're seeing that are being led by Black women, from Black Lives Matter to the natural hair and learning to appreciate yourself. And so there's a bunch of different ways that Black women have become a little bit more foundational in the things that are happening today. And so I do believe we're headed in a direction of seeing more women of color in a lot of these larger political spaces. But I don't want to necessarily count out the work that has been done by the individuals who are mobilizing people to utilize their power to break down the system that oppresses us.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. Thank all of you. I'm going to ask you to do a final sort of comment. I do want to thank you for your commitment to to obviously participating in Voices Behind the Vote, talking about women in power, talking about the importance of voting and importance of women of color walking in their power. So if I could just get you to kind of do a 1 minute, not 1 minute, just a quick sentence to close us out. I'm going to ask everybody for their, just to do a sort of a wrap up for us. And again, my thanks to you for participating and for lending not just your voice, but in so many ways, your resources, because I've been taking some notes, so there are strategies in here that I think lots of that we can use to go to another level. So Jessica, can I start with you as I thank you?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first, thanks to you, Andrea, and your team over there for making this happen and inviting me to participate in this. But if I had to say one thing, I would just say that, let's, use our individual power and our collective power to hopefully, change the institutional power that exists to be more reflective, more equitable. So hopefully I can help be a part of that.
I hope so. Thank you so much. Khyla?
Thank you again, Andrea. I think that my wrap-up comment would be, no matter where you're stationed in life, you have the ability to lend your voice and your power to this greater cause for justice, whether it's through the electoral process or holding our officials accountable. You don't have to be an elected official, but we would love for you to be one. But everybody has the ability to impact this process, and I'm very grateful for our position as attorneys to be able to not only utilize the vote but also enforce our rights that the Constitution provides. So thank you again to you, and I hope that if anybody has any questions, we can continue this dialogue about our electoral process on social media at NAACP or at Craine is my Twitter handle. If you want to engage with me about it as well.
Good, thank you. Faith, can I get a wrap-up comment from you?
Sure, absolutely. Again, I echo my co-panelists here. Thank you again, Andrea, for this opportunity and for the NAACP to open this dialogue on African American women in the voting and political process. I think one of my all-time favorite commercials is an old shampoo commercial where she tells two friends about a product and they tell two friends and so on and so on. I think analogy, we take one person to the polls and we can take two people, we can take a busload, we can take a truckload of people to the polls, and that can be our way to work in the political process. We all have something that we can contribute. I think our voices and to make our issues known is limitless and boundless. I also like to look at the impact that our First Lady has had in the political process. She's made it good to want to exercise and to be fit again. So there is power in voices that may not be as vocal or as loud, but also our presence will be known. And I think if we take the opportunity to teach, be patient with each other, and we can learn from each other and different strategies to use to get folks out and to make sure our issues are known. And I know we here at the National Action Network do that every day in our local communities, and we'll continue to do it. And I look forward to working with each of you soon.
Great. And Erin, can I get you to give us a wrap-up comment?
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Maya Angelou is, if you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude. And so, in that, that's just something that, I encourage people to live by, I live by, and so that's one thing as community organizers and people a part of the movement that we can continue to lean on, and to know that there is always something. There's always work to be done, no matter where you are, who you are, and what you're doing. And then just more specifically, the Youth and College Division within Region 6. I'm sure I can speak for nationally to say that we are all engaged in our efforts in making sure that our voices are represented as Black women. Baylor NAACP, for all of you guys who have Twitter, we are in the process, we're in the middle of a social media campaign for raising awareness for cultural competence in higher education. And so if you guys have any social media accounts, follow the BU Remember When hashtag. On that, we are sharing stories from students on campus in order to bring awareness to some of the demands that we are asking of our predominantly white institution in terms of cultural competence and diversity and inclusion. So that's one thing that I just wanted to put out there that we're working on with the Baylor NAACP. And so other than that, I'm so thankful for this opportunity to be a part of this great panel discussion. Yeah, that's it for me.
Well, again, ladies, I want to, I promised that I would be respectful of your time, and so I want to thank you again for being voices behind the vote. Thank you for being women of color and more importantly, women of power and influence. And so I encourage you to keep doing what you do, and I thank you in advance for taking it to another level. And I think, Jessica, I will say, we have stolen your quote, faith turned it all around, but we will be mindful of being experts of our own experiences. And so again, thank you so much, and I look forward to further dialogue on this most important issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.